is Richard Henry Raedeke. I was the 11th pastor to serve the church. I was also I was also at the church for 11 years. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history and how I was trained, and then we're going to go into my personality a little bit and my family, and also the work and the experiences, the good people I met at Peace Lutheran. And the main thing is, Peace Lutheran was the home that I adopted. They adopted me. It was my home. So let's start out. I was born in January 16th, 1909. My father, Henry J., was a pastor, and my mother, Rose Taylor, was a pastor's wife, and they worked very well together. They were teamed up very well. There were 10 siblings in the family, and my oldest sister, Hildegard, passed away at 13 days. My father was in charge of several little churches over northwest of Willmar, Minnesota, and I was born in Fairview Township in Swift County. Trinity Lutheran Church is where I was. I got my early schooling, my parochial schooling, and when I was confirmed in 1923 at 14. My verse was Matthew 16:25. He who saves his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for me will find it. When I turned 15, I decided I'd be a minister. So I went to a Carver school, high school first, and eventually I went to Concordia High School. And then from Concordia High School, I went to Concordia College, and I graduated from Concordia College in 1929. And one of the things about my personality, during the summer months, I would always be on farms. And so when I look over here and see the farmland and the wetland over there, I was very athletic. I liked to fish and hunt. And I knew German very well. I was very organized. And let's see, I was a good singer, and in school, this was an adjustment. I wrote left-handed, and you know what happens when you write left-handed in school? They wrap you on the knuckles until you write with the right hand. So I ate with my left hand, and I wrote with my right hand. The second year I was at St. Louis, when I went to, after 1929, I went to St. Louis for divinity school. My roommate said, "There's a lady I'd like to have you meet." Her name was Helen Brunkhorst. Helen Brunkhorst. I said, okay, and I met, no, I'm sorry, it's Ruth. Helen's my daughter, excuse me. I met Ruth Brunkhorst, and she was a very athletic girl. She was a basketball player, a forward or a center on the basketball team, and she was very attractive. So we talked a little bit, and I told her I'm athletic, and we went and played tennis. And she beat me playing tennis, and she really beat me badly. And then after that, every time I played her against in tennis, I won, and I always won. And you know why I always won? Because she let me. Because she was interested in me and thought, you know, maybe he's a good preacher catch, so you just never know. And rule number 17, you have to help me. Carol, will you help me with rule number 17? Now, I've met you, and so I always remember your name. You remember that? Cool. I wanted to see Ruth, but I couldn't always see her. Rule number 17. So what I did, I joined St. Matthew's Church. Ruth was in the choir. And so I was a tenor, I joined the choir, and she was a soprano. So once a week we got a chance to see each other. Rule number 17 is when you go to the seminary, you cannot be married during that time, and you cannot be engaged at that time. So in 1933, when I graduated and had that sheepskin, I asked Ruth if we could be engaged, if she would be engaged to me, and she accepted. Now I wrote home a nice letter to my parents. I said, I found a wonderful woman. And I listed all her qualities. And Ruth said to me, when you become a minister, I will follow you anywhere you go. And we were a good team, and we like two horses pulling together. Now, I vicared in Canada and Oklahoma. And then I took my first call. I had 5 calls. I took my first call down to Oklahoma. And I was there for a while. Where I was ordained and took on this one church. And then I also had churches in Kansas, Illinois, and in 1963 I came to Hutchinson, Minnesota, to Peace Lutheran Church. Now what really impressed me was the brick on the church and how beautiful it was. And there was a parsonage right next door. It was the nicest house that Ruth and I had ever lived in. So we took that, and I thought, boy, this is really good. This is really good for us. So I made a lot of good friends here, and I have to tell you, one of the friends that I met, and you probably know him, Marty Lutke. Do you remember Marty Lutke? Marty and I became good friends, and I said, Marty, I hear you have a cemetery. Could you take me there? He brought me out here, and it didn't look at all like this. It was like a diamond in the rough, I thought. It needed some attention. So between Marty and myself, we got together with some other gentlemen. I said, we're going to develop this into a beautiful cemetery like you see today. And I came to the highest point. I came to the highest point on the cemetery over here, and I chose a plot right here so I could look that direction and see farmland, and that direction and see wetland. And when I said to Marty, you know what, Marty, I'm going to go someplace where the smallest evergreen tree was. And the evergreen tree at that time was only that big. And look how big it is now. Marty used to fill his boat full of water because we did not have a well. And he would drive that full of water from Hutchinson up here so he could water. Then Lorraine Meyer came along and she helped dig a well out here, so he didn't have to do that anymore. But Marty was a character. I enjoyed him very much. I'll tell you two other people that were really important to me. One was Helen Nissy. Now Helen was the secretary for the church, and she knew so much about the church. I'm sure she could baptize them and bury them and confirm them and maybe play the organ too, all at the same time. But she was a treat to me to have as a partner running the church. And then I also want to tell you something special. I teamed up with a gentleman by the name of Walter Marth, and we became a very good team. The kids called him the child pastor, and I was the godfather. But between Dean and myself and Helen, it was a wonderful combination, and we worked very well. Now, I happened to have a chance to talk to the Marth family earlier today, and I'm glad I had a chance to once again tell them how much I appreciated working with Dean. So one of the things that being a pastor's wife, you always have to be ready for everything. So I had Ruth, when it came time for the weekend, if we were going to have a dessert, I said make two. One for the family and one for the guests that we possibly might have. And sure enough, if you remember, Bob Albright was involved with Minnesota mining. One day Bob and his wife were walking around the outside of the church. I stopped and said hello and introduced myself. I said, well, come on in. I think my wife has some fresh pie that she's made, and sure she did, because the kids hadn't gotten to it yet. And so and that was the rule. That was for company, unknown company coming. And also there's an acronym that I think it's, let's see, FBO. I think that's it. And it happens when Ruth would whisper that to the kids when guests were over there. F was for family. Back was for B, off, family back off. So don't fill your plate. That was what that stood for. And the kids didn't like that at all. But I always had plenty of food then to share with the guests, and that was the way to do it. That was the way to do it. So we had a lot of interesting times. After I was in Hutchinson, I retired in 1974. And then I just went a little ways down the road to Glencoe, where I was a visitation pastor at First Lutheran over in Glencoe. And I was there until 1980. And then after that, Helen got an apartment for us down in Nebraska. Now, Helen had this apartment about 17 miles away from where she lived. And also some of my other children were there. So it was easier for them to come to visit. But it wasn't like Hutchinson going down there. It wasn't like home. We were down there until 1981, and I wasn't feeling well, and I was sent to Lincoln, Nebraska, to the hospital over there. And the doctor examined me, and then Helen and Ruth were waiting with me, and the doctor came in and said, Richard, I have some news to tell you. You don't have long. You have such an enlarged heart that you've got limited time. Wow. Helen, Ruth, and I all cried together. But I accepted what God had laid out in front of me. I'd done that all my life. Whatever he has for me, I know it's for my good. And then Helen told us that she was carrying child, her first child. So that's just how God does it, doesn't he? One, Raedeke is leaving, and another one's coming along. Wow. Well, Ruth and I talked it over and said, we don't really belong here. We belong back in Hutchinson. That's where all our friends are. And we were air ambulanced from Nebraska to Glencoe, and then eventually Ruth and I got an apartment on Jefferson Street, 325, room number 8, apartment number 8, and that's where we stayed. And that was like being home again. In the spring of 1982, I went to church, sitting off the side. I was tethered to oxygen. It was communion. And the pastor and the elder, after serving all the other communicants, came up to me getting ready to serve me communion. And I stood up from my seat. I threw my shoulders back. I said, Lord, here I am, a servant of yours, taking communion. In August of 1982, I was back in the hospital, in the Hutchinson Hospital. Now, I did something just for myself. I sang this song while I was in the hospital. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And then I stopped. I couldn't go on anymore. It was so touching. My whole life had been dedicated to the Lord. And now I was accepting what I was getting, what I was doing. I was fine. He gave me the strength. Gave me the strength to see this through. One time, Jim Marshall, the associate pastor, was visiting with me, and no family members were there. And we were talking. And I turned to Jim and I said, it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. And I closed my eyes and I fell asleep in the arms of the Lord. Now, you can look at that however you want. Maybe God gave me a chance to open up the door a little bit to where we all want to go and just let you know, there's something better waiting for each one of us when we go to heaven.